It takes a brave and independent mindset to go tiny. If you are trying to figure out your tiny pivot, this podcast is here to inspire and connect you with the other unconventional, gritty, inspirational people within this community. I am Laura Lynch, your tiny house friend and host. On this show, we are always going to come back to money because as a financial planner, this is the question I hear the most. How do I make this work for me financially? Well, that's my jam, so jump in, let's go. New episodes drop every Thursday. Well, Jordan Liberata, welcome to Less House, More Moolah podcast. Super excited to have this conversation with you today about placing a tiny home on land. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. It's really great to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah. So for listeners listening on the podcast, in case you have a chance to jump over to YouTube, I have moved my studio to my tiny house loft, which is kind of an interesting look. So you should check it out on YouTube. But anyway, Jordan, would you please introduce yourself and share with us how you became so passionate about tiny homes?
Yes, absolutely. So I am a tiny house author. So I've written a few books about tiny houses. I love tiny houses. I'm very excited about tiny houses, and I really see them as a great tool for people to achieve what they want to achieve. Um, my tiny house journey kind of began maybe 7 years ago, when I stayed in an Airbnb that was a tiny house, and it was this off-grid kind of, garage door opening little cabin in the woods with a porta potty, a very nice one, a really nice porta potty, the nicest I've ever seen. Um, and it was so nice. I mean, it had no address. It just was so minimal, connected to nature, and I just loved it. And it kind of excited me about, oh, maybe bigger is not better. Maybe maybe it can just be simple. Simple's good. So I proceeded to really get interested in tiny houses from there. Start learning about them, reading about them, watching shows about them. I think most people who have engaged with tiny houses probably have done it through shows, at least primarily because they're very cool. You watch these shows and wow, that's such a pretty little cute tiny house. Um, and I did that too. And then I got to a point where I said, well, how do I go from here to actually living in one? What does that look like? And because there's a lot of content that's about pictures, that's about seeing people's finished tiny houses, but you have no idea how it got there or what they did to build it. Um, and so I decided, okay, I'm going to learn this for myself. And the outcome of that was I took all of this research. I tend to get a little, shall we say, I like to go down the rabbit hole. So I got really into this, and I read a lot. I talked to a lot of people, um, and realized, I think there's a need for some of this content to be organized. I've done all this research, so I took that and I put it into 3 different books that help people understand tiny houses and build tiny houses on wheels, and then, like we're here to talk about today, deal with land and also finances in my third book. So, yeah, it's been really fun. I mean, I've learned a ton about tiny houses and more importantly, met a lot of cool people. Um, so, yeah, I love tiny houses.
Yeah, I think that's awesome because anytime there's a new thing out, right, there's a lot of content or a lot of talk or a lot of ideas or a lot of photos, right? But the actual synthesizing of the information in a way that is digestible and usable is, especially in this tiny house world, since a lot has changed in not that long of a time. I'm sure that that's a really valuable product for folks, your books, the ability to kind of bring all of the interwebs together into concise and vetted information that can help people actually practically accomplish what they want to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, practical is really the key word there. I think there's a lot of tiny house content that is great. I mean, there's tons of great content, but a lot of it is oriented towards, hey, I'm selling a tiny house, or I'm building tiny houses, or have cool pictures of tiny houses. And at a certain point, you need to get into the a little bit more tedious, boring stuff. So, that stuff's really important. Um, so the practical aspect and just, kind of clear advice of what makes the most sense. So yes, 100% with you, Laura.
Yeah, so you've covered three topics in your books. Tell us about the scope and process of your research. It sounds like you're kind of nerdy in this regard. And
Yes.
so I'd love to hear how you kind of gathered and, streamlined and, organized and kind of what that looked like through your research process.
Yeah, for sure. So, um, yes, I am a little nerdy. I studied engineering, and I'm a trained technical writer. And my background, most of my career has been spent in technical communication. So I kind of have this mix of really um, being able to understand complicated things, but then communicate them to people. That's really been my career. So I was able to apply this to tiny houses as well. Um, as far as the scope, it was really all about okay, day zero, or day one, whatever. Somebody is at I don't even know what a tiny house is, and you know the end goal being I now live in a tiny house. So how do we get from A to B? How do we get from 0 to 100? And that was kind of the scope. So the scope was really what are the problems that people are facing that are preventing this process. So obviously the first one is well, what are tiny houses in the first place? You know, what are they? Why do people live in them? Why are they such a trend? Because there's a million reasons people could be interested in tiny houses, personally or just in general. So let's just introduce that, right? Um, and then it's well, I got to be able to build one, I got to be able to place one, I got to be able to afford one, I got to do all this legally. How do I do this? So the scope was very much that practicality. How do we solve some problems for people? Um, and my process started with just a massive amount of reading. Reading blogs. There are tons of good tiny house blogs. There's tiny house industry associations. There's advocacy groups. There's great Facebook groups. I got involved in all of this. So I just kind of embedded myself in the tiny house world and said, what's going on here? Let me figure it out. And of course, plenty of YouTube videos too, right? There's still the videos, people, building tiny houses, or hey, this is how you install a shower stall in a corner. How do you do it, right? Stuff too. So tons and tons of content, and luckily I have a good background in understanding how to filter good content from not so good content. So understanding, okay, this is legitimate. This is maybe just one person's experience, which has tons of merit, but there might be a caveat to, for example, if you build a tiny house in, let's say, Texas, the insulation you use is quite different than that of a tiny house in Seattle. So how do we figure out those differences, right? Anecdotally. So so my process was first just amassing this information and figuring out where's the good content. Um, and then it was let's organize this content in a way that's practical for people, regardless of why they're going to tiny houses, right? That's a key thing here. And a beautiful thing about the tiny house world, there's a million reasons people do this. People are doing it for financial reasons, they're doing it for sustainability reasons, they're doing it to get off grid, they're doing it because they want to be connected to nature or they want to be mobile. There's so many different backgrounds. So I just said, well, tiny house is kind of the unifying factor here. Let's focus on practically how to get people into tiny houses. And that was kind of the result of the research was putting together these books. And I then took that back to the community and said, hey, I need architects to review this. I need people in real estate to review this. I need people who've done tiny houses to review this. So making sure that the research I did was peer reviewed and checked, making sure that it's good. I mean, that's the whole point is making sure that people actually get help from this stuff. So, um, yeah, I mean, that's kind of it, Laura. Not nothing, not rocket science, but thorough, I'd say.
Yeah, and that's really cool because it's not just your experience or the experience of a couple people. It's really a collection and a collation of all of the
Yeah,
data, and then using experts in the field to review before it goes out. I think that's, probably the most academic, right?
yeah.
Tiny house writing that's out there. So that's awesome. So let's zero in a little bit on your research and what you learned about selecting land for a tiny home.
hmm
Um, as you were, writing that third book and thinking about, placement, what did you learn specifically about that idea?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's where to begin. No, I think with with land. Well, firstly, it's really hard. It's the hardest. It's the hardest part of this whole process was what I learned. Um, Plenty of stories from people, but I actually did conducted a survey. Nothing formal. I mean, I did it on Facebook, right? I did a big tiny house Facebook group and basically said, "Hey, what's your biggest challenge with tiny houses?" Uh, Number one response was affordability. So that's a big category. Number two was finding land and zoning. So navigating the process of, if I build a tiny house and I store it in like a warehouse, where do I actually put it? That was the second biggest problem, ahead of how to build it, ahead of all the design questions, right? That was it. So it was clear. It's clearly a quite a problem. So that was my big thing I learned about it. The second thing I learned about it is a little bit more optimistic, which is that the thing that makes it complicated is actually the thing that makes it possible to have a tiny house, which is zoning is not consistent. So if you look, for example, in Europe, zoning is at a national level. I know we'll talk about what zoning really means, but basically the in Europe they say this is what you're allowed to do nationally. So, for all of France, let's say. And that's it. That's the law, right? So that's what you can do. So if your country doesn't allow tiny houses, well, too bad. Here, it's decentralized. It's all at a local level, which is quite difficult to navigate, but it leaves a lot of gray area, a lot of room to actually find a place to put a tiny house. So for those who are willing to do the work and willing to build the relationships needed to do that, it's very possible. It's very possible to place a tiny house in a way that's consistent with your local zoning law, and and, and to do it by the book. We could certainly talk about doing it not by the book and going around everything. That maybe is a whole different thing entirely, because plenty of people do that, and it comes with real risks, but it comes with advantages too. So there's kind of the, do you want to go by the book versus do you want to just go kind of, kind of just go rogue and say, you know what, I might not, I won't get caught. But you have to ask, like, what's it mean? What's that actually mean for you if something goes wrong? So yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think that you're so right there. It's just like so many other, you know, regulations and laws in our country that are so disparate depending on where you are. And so if you find the right place, then, you can have you can have a unconventional life there. It's just a matter of finding the place that's going to be easy or legal or nobody's going to enforce any rules, which is the kind of the gray area you were talking about. So let's define for listeners who may be new to this topic.
Mhm.
Let's define zoning, building codes, and we'll get into some of the building standards used from tiny home builders too. But can you define zoning and building codes and help us understand what is the difference? On Less House More Mola, we hear so many stories of people living unconventional lives. Each of them is literally building their alt American dream. Are you tired of putting your dreams on hold because of money? Well, let's fix it. I have a two-part offering that is here to help you. First, I'm going to give you access to my financial freedom calculator so that you'll understand your numbers and have a tangible starting point. This is free. And then, second, we'll book a session to figure out your finances so that you can live your alt American dream as soon as possible. This is paid. Why am I giving you something for free? Because I'm passionate about empowering people to choose an unconventional path. So let's work together to figure out money so that you will know that you've officially taken action on your plans. This offering is for you if you're unsure of your cost of living or how much savings you might need. You don't know what money move to make next. You dream of an unconventional life built on your terms. You're seeking a permanent solution and not a one time motivational boost. You want to learn about money from someone who shares your interest in breaking away from the norm. So, what do you think? Are you tired of starting sentences with someday when I? Then go to altamericandream.com and get the financial freedom calculator.
Yes. So zoning and building codes go hand in hand. They're kind of like siblings in this process. To start with, zoning is all about land. Building codes are all about construction. So zoning, let's take, you know, imagine you're your county, or your town or city. What happens is they take all the land in the county, they divide it up into little parcels or plots of land. That could be, a tenth of an acre to 100 acres, whatever. But they have these plots of land. They then assign each parcel, excuse me, to a zone. So a zone could be industrial, agricultural, residential, single family, residential, multifamily, um, retail. There's tons of different options. Those are just some examples. It's different everywhere. But basically, they're saying, okay, each parcel of land, you're allowed to. It basically falls into this category, and then within that category, they have an ordinance. The ordinance says this is what you're allowed to do within that category. So, you know, single family home, you're allowed to have in there for a single family. You have to follow these specific rules, such as where the house is placed on the property. You can't have more than 20 people living in this house, something like that, right? So basically, at high level, zoning is the local municipality divides the land up and then says this is what you're allowed to do with this land based on the categorization of it.
And so it's land use. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they get to
More or less, yeah.
decide how land is used. So a tiny house, is it a single family home?
Ah, great question. Who knows? That's the beauty of it. And I know it's kind of intimidating to say it that way. Who knows, right? A lot of zoning ordinances, if you look at the majority of them, they don't refer to tiny houses. Some do. Right? You will find some that do. And those are great because they've worked with tiny houses before, but many don't. So, you look at a zoning ordinance and you find it directly from the department or on the website of the local government. And the zoning ordinance is going to have a list of things. You've got your duplex, dormitories, you have your bed and breakfast, you have your townhouse, you have just a single home, standalone. All these categories. Well, tiny house isn't there. And it begs the question, if you have a tiny house on wheels, especially, it begs the question, is this a house? Or is this an RV? Or is this neither? And that question does not have a universal answer. And in fact, there are ways to make your tiny house an RV specifically, if you want, um, which means that it will be treated by the law and by zoning boards and building councils as an RV. So you have to weigh the pros and cons. Do I want it to be an RV? Because you can, right? But then it's not a house, it's an RV. So it kind of is this gray area. It's this gray area. So to your question, is it Is it a single family home? It depends on what the local government has to say and really what you agree on with them. And something I harp on with people is that it's really important to work with them, not against them. You know, you gotta collaborate. It's good to find places that want people living there. Um, Typically, rural areas trying to draw in people. They want to work with you. They want to stimulate their economy. They want to have more residents there, and there's some flexibility. So you're looking for those places that are flexible, and then working with them and saying, hey, we're gonna. They might change their zoning ordinance to include a tiny house for you. Probably not right away, but they might do it, after you've done it, after you've been there for 5 years. But they might say, you know what, to us, this is a single family dwelling, and we're just going to give you a special permit to allow it to be on wheels, or to allow it to not to be so small, to be 300 square feet. Um, so yeah, it's kind of a gray area.
Yeah, it's interesting because at some point, somewhere in the history, people had to put manufactured homes in those
Yep.
categories, right? And you'll find that there are certain zones where manufactured homes are allowed and certain zones where manufactured homes aren't allowed. So even when you break down residential, you'll find different allowable land uses in residential based on what the municipality and those people voting people into power and all of that
Yeah.
are allowing and content with in their area. There's certain lots of residential zones where you can't have a manufactured home, right? So yeah, so it's kind of tiny homes are maybe following that history of what manufactured homes went through, being that they showed up on wheels too.
Hmm. Yep.
And tiny homes are still fighting to get written into the zoning.
Yes. Yes, for sure. And it's the trend is positive in general for tiny houses. There's like you're not seeing you're not seeing places often going away from tiny houses. They're typically moving towards it. But for anyone listening, you might be the first person to talk to your local municipality about tiny houses. It's possible. You might be the 100th. So it kind of depends, but there is definitely a positive trend. And there's trends in zoning. There's also trends in building codes, which I haven't even gotten into, but there's positive trends in general.
Yeah, awesome. So go there. Building codes. Help us understand that.
Yes. So building codes, so zoning's about land, building codes is about the building itself. So the actual construction. Um, there are tons of different kinds of codes. So there's the the IRC is really the main like residential code that houses are built upon. But you also have codes for plumbing, for electric, for fire, for wastewater. There's codes for tons of stuff, and this is really just, I mean, at its core, in a completely perfect world, this is 100% about safety. So it's about making sure that homes are built safely, people living in them can dependably be there and know that it was constructed properly, right? It's kind of the local government saying, you know what, we have validated that this is a legitimate building. So that's why it's there. So it's not something to be ignored. I think that's another important aspect for people who are deciding, well, do I go by the book or do I kind of go on my own? Um, please don't lose sight of the safety element of some of this, because it is quite tedious to deal with. Your building, your planning department who manages building codes and your zoning department. It can feel tedious. You're like, oh, this is too much. Um, but don't build a structure that's going to collapse. you know, like, like don't build a structure that's going to have an electrical fire. These things matter a lot. So yeah, that's just a quick caveat. But the building codes are really fundamentally a safety measure, and the the way that they work is you have kind of a council, the ICC, it's called International Code Council, and they every 3 years they publish a new set of codes. We're actually in a year that they published. So 2024 has a new set of codes. They then they kind of create the code, but it's not enforced down to the local level. It's rather adopted by the local level. So states adopt the code, and we're just talking U.S. So if we're talking, other countries, they have their own code. But in the U.S., the states adopt the code. Last I checked, 49 states plus DC adopt the code. Wisconsin doesn't. Last I checked. Um, it's similar, but they have their own. So you're already kind of starting to see, okay, we're getting kind of localized, right? That's just how it is. Um, and so those states adopt the code, and then some states say at a local level, you can adopt the code as a county or a city, or not. You can have your own as well. So some cities have their own building codes. So basically, you've got these standards. You've got these codes which apply to different standards, and then that gets adopted down to the local level. So for anybody trying to figure this out and who's like got their head spinning after what I'm talking about, all you need to do is go online and Google building codes in my state, or Google IRC, and go to the .org website. That is the ICC website. And just get accustomed to how it works. You'll see all these different code options, and it's tedious, but it's not rocket science. It's not written in a way that's super complicated. It's just, I mean, imagine writing a whole book about how to build a house. There's a lot of content, but it's organized quite well. It's a digital library for you. Um, so yeah, the building codes are essentially that way of saying this is how to build the house in compliance with what we have determined as a council makes sense and is safe.
And so, is there a building code for tiny houses?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So building codes in general apply to any dwelling. So uh, you have your building code, your IRC. Most states right now are in 2018, IRC 2018 or IRC 2021, because it takes time for the states to actually adopt the new code. And a tiny house, everything applies to a tiny house. Like, how do I put it? If you're building a house, you have to follow the code. If you're building a tiny house, you also have to follow the code. That doesn't change. Um, Now, if you're going to do the RV route, that's a different story. RV has its own set of standards, so you're going to go the RV standard route. But let's say you're going the house route. If you're going to build a house, small or otherwise, it has code. But starting in 2018, the codes had some relaxation for tiny houses. And in 2018, it was called Appendix Q. So that allowed for tiny houses on wheels, specifically on wheels, to have relaxation. A good example, um, you're sitting in your loft, Laura, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
typically in a standard tiny house, a standard home, a non-tiny house, there's a minimum height from floor to ceiling of a floor, whether it's a loft or otherwise. Well, that's not practical in a tiny house. So Appendix Q said, well, you know what? It's okay. It's actually not a big deal we don't if we don't have a full floor. If we have kind of a half of the floor, it's okay. If this dwelling is 400 square feet or less, that's the key. Don't go building your tiny house 410 square feet because it's not a tiny house now. So 400 square feet or less, then it's okay. We can have a loft, and we can have the skylight function as an egress window for fire escape. So there's some relaxation, and the whole idea is some pioneers in the tiny house industry said, we've got to get this legal. People need to be able to live this way. They want to, but also, I mean, it's societally speaking, we need people to be able to live in a more affordable manner. This is a great tool to do it. We've got to be able to loosen this. And they brought it forward to the ICC, and they said, yeah, this is a good idea. And since then, this is the great. This is really exciting. Since then, it's improved, and it keeps improving. And we are moving now towards having full code for 2027 on how to build a tiny house on wheels properly, with the chassis and the trailer and everything. How is that done properly? And that's really exciting because tiny house on wheels is, I think, what we all think of as a tiny house when we first envision one, but also is it has so much flexibility. You know, it's so usable. So like I said before, things are really moving in a great direction. Yeah, yeah. So for tiny houses, you gotta look at the appendix for the code that your municipality has adopted.
Yeah, so I volunteer with the Tiny Home Industry Association on the resource map, which maps out across the United States the different zoning, the different zoning details and the building codes both. And it is intensely, to your point, because it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction, municipality by municipality. It is really, really complex to stay up to date with what is going on with different adoptions. In 2021, it was Appendix AQ,
Yep.
right?
Now
Yep.
it's
And
BB.
so,
2024, I think it's
yeah.
BB. Yeah.
Yeah, so really, really interesting. Stairs being another
Mm-hmm.
one that, gets some loosened, the riser heights, get a little bit in the tread, the depths. So interesting. My tiny house that I'm in was built largely to electrical code in that Eric, my husband, is an electrician. And so certainly safety was really important. Likewise, the plumbing, very much to code. But yeah, the loft height, right? I'm sitting in it right now. And if I am a little taller, right, I'm hitting my
Yeah.
head. And, we have sort of a ladder coming up here, and definitely you have to make some modifications in order to fit into that small space if you're going to, have anything other than, just one floor or what have you. Lots of different, things that have to be loosened. So let's talk about what we might look for, from a
Sure.
zoning and building code standpoint when we're looking for land. So thanks for that explanation, Jordan. I think that was really concise and helpful for folks that are navigating this world for the first time. I guess, I kind of live it every day or hear about it all the time. And so it is kind of somewhat less confusing for me. But for most people, they don't know what their property is zoned or what the building codes were that were used when their home was built. And they don't know the difference. So I think that was really helpful. So if someone is out there thinking about going tiny and thinking about putting on land, what might they want to look for in terms of a place related to the zoning and building
Sure.
codes?
So so when placing the tiny house, you're really looking at zoning more so than code, right? Because wherever you place it, you're going to have to adhere to code. Um, if you're mobile, that's a different story. But as far as finding a proper place for it, your first step is really go to your local jurisdiction's website. Try to find the zoning map, which is often just a PDF. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it's an interactive live map, GIS it's called. Um, so you might even look for a GIS link on the website. But typically, from what I've seen, it's not that. Typically, it's just a PDF with color coded, agricultural, residential, retail, etc., school zoning. So You're looking for that, and simultaneously you're looking for the ordinance, the zoning ordinance. So the ordinance says, okay, we've got these zones, you have the map, but just because it says single family, what does that actually mean? So the ordinance explains what that actually means. So you're looking for both of those on the website. Um, that's your first step. Just read it, take your time. It's often large, but it's often, again, it's readable. It's not. I don't want to say it's simple, because I don't think it's necessarily simple, but it's not so complex that if you don't scan through, look for what you're actually trying to find, which is residential, or sometimes mixed use, even agritourism type zoning. Those categories are where you're going to really find your information. And if you're looking for building a tiny house community, you might even be looking more in a multifamily, or in hotel zoning, or campground zoning. So it's not there's not a series of numbers and letters for this. It's usually explained in English. It says zoning, residential, multifamily, residential, single family, residential, tiny house. If you're super lucky, you're probably not going to see that, but you might. So you just look for that residential zoning and read it. Read what it says. Typically, you're going to have three different things per zone. You're going to have what is permitted, what is not permitted, and what is special or conditional permission. So that means you could do it if the zoning council board team says yes. And that's usually what you're actually looking for. Because unless you're going to a place that says, hey, tiny houses, come on in, we want you, we all do this, it's fine. Unless you're looking for that, unless you find a place like that, you're going to want to find a place that says, hey, we might take this. This would be good. We have some gray area. We want to work with you. It won't say tiny house necessarily. It might, but just say, hey, single family, um, alternative use, special or conditional permit, or another one that's super common, and certainly uh, some listeners might be looking at, is the ADU. So that means accessory dwelling unit. Basically, you have a house on a foundation, a traditional home, and you want to put a tiny house in the backyard. That's the accessory dwelling unit. That's the ADU. Most zoning ordinances have language around that specific situation of having an ADU. So you're just reading through this and trying to understand, okay, what are the rules? What are the things that I might be able to do? What are the things I know I can't do? And you're going to take that information and you're going to file it away and say, okay, cool, I know this. Now is where it's important to actually have the conversation with the local zoning committee or board. I keep changing the words, it can be whatever, with the local zoning board. So this is where it's really important, because you don't really want to leave it up to chance, especially if you're buying land. You don't want to buy land and then say, well, I could get a special permit, I'll be okay. And then they say, no, we don't do tiny houses, or we changed our mind. You really, if you can, you want to get it in writing that they're going to work with you. At the very least, you want to build a relationship with them so that you know that there is going to be an opportunity to get the um, to get the permits that you need to be doing this properly. So that's really the way, if you're going about it the way of, I want to have my own land that I own or I lease, and I put this tiny house on it. The other route is more, all right, I am just going to take my chances and not do that. Typically, if you're doing that, you're not buying land, most likely. You're probably making an agreement with a farmer, or making an agreement with somebody who owns land zoned for hunting, even. I don't know if that's a good idea. given what hunting means, you'll have people shooting around you, but um, you're just making a deal kind of off the books and saying, okay, I'm just gonna live here, and if I have a tiny house on wheels and a pickup truck and I get kicked out, then I can leave. Um, and there are certainly plenty of people who do that, or who do something in the middle where they say, I'm going to live here permanently and take my chances. As you can probably tell by how I'm talking, I don't love this approach, but at the same time, a lot of people make this decision because it's really, especially in the past, it's felt really necessary, and is fundamentally, it's easier. It's not lower risk, but it is easier because you don't have to deal with any of this stuff. Um, but there are horror stories out there to consider if you do that. So, I mean, I remember talking to somebody who lived, she had lived on land for a couple of years, and she basically had a neighbor complain to the local, I think zoning, it was either zoning or planning department, and said, hey, there's this tiny house, I don't like it. And that's how it starts usually. They said, yeah, okay, we'll check it out. They came by, they said, this is, you didn't get permission to do this. And then it started this whole, almost like, not an actual lawsuit, but a whole scenario between her and the local government, where she's already on their bad side because she didn't get permission. And now she has to go through the challenges of, and the money of remediating the situation. So she did get it resolved, which is really nice. But it's just something, it's something to consider. So yeah, when going by the book or not.
What about ag zoning? How is that a little bit more easy to deal
Mm,
with? Or what are your thoughts on ag zoning?
yeah, ag zoning can work. Agricultural, if you, for one, zoning can change. So that's something to consider. You could say, I found a plot of land. It's agricultural zoned, but I think this is great for residential. Why not? Uh, or it's agricultural zoned, but they're saying you can have a house here because think of your typical farm. It has a house, it has a barn, it has crops, right? So you can work within that too. You can work within that too. It just comes down to the local municipality what they say. And, you know, same with like anywhere you see tourism, that's typically a good sign because that typically means that they really want people to build rural economy. They want people there. They want to bring other people in. You might have some. I heard another story of somebody who they did the ag tourism route and they were required to have some sort of public facing um, service or attraction. So they made like a little petting zoo with goats, basically, so they could live there. That was they were primarily living there because they wanted to live there in their tiny house, but they needed to have this public facing thing, and so they had this little business on the side that gave them the permission to do it. So get creative. I mean, look at the different zoning, look at the maps. Agricultural can work. Um, you might be able to convince them to change the zoning or the zoning mapping. That does happen. I mean, every time you see a development company change like old warehouses into apartments, that's a change of zoning. So it happens all the time. The key is to be creative and to work with them, collaborate.
So, most of the folks listening to this, if they go tiny, they're probably going to buy a tiny home either from someone who has one or from a builder. So, in terms of going back to building codes, which, of course, as you described, governs the construction
Yep.
of the living space. So, how do we know or pick a builder that's actually going to build codes that comply with the rules in the jurisdiction in which we perhaps want to buy land and park our tiny house? How would we know how to
Yeah.
navigate that?
Yeah, that can be challenging. I think first and foremost, um, just because a house is smaller doesn't make it easier to build. So tiny houses come with their own set of challenges from a construction perspective, especially on wheels. It's a whole different ballgame. So if you have, I've heard this too many times of somebody just getting their tiny house built by a person with construction background who's not done tiny houses before, and they end up with a house that's way too heavy, especially if it's on a trailer. Um, it's different. It's different. So, but it is still a house, so it still requires expertise. So definitely, you know, do your due diligence when selecting somebody to buy your or to build your tiny house. Um, if you're having it built from scratch. Um, Secondly, as far as the building code question itself, um, you got to kind of ask, well, what's my goal? What are my plans here? If you know you're going to put it in a certain place, get an idea of the different building codes that they use in that area. If they're IRC 2018 versus IRC 2024 versus they have their own, find out what they are, and then communicate that to your builder and make sure that they can and will comply to that. When you look at the tiny house industry, there's a lot of tiny house specific construction companies that have been around and more that are popping up. So they are very tuned in. They are very much part of those tiny house industry associations, or the Tiny House Industry Association, but also Tiny House Alliance. They're part of these groups, these advocacy groups. So they're tied in. So you should consult with them, talk to them, and make sure everybody's on the same page. Um, Unfortunately, there's no like catch-all. I wish there was this catch-all. This is exactly what I need for my land. This is exactly what I need for my building. Everything just, I could do a quick Google search or ask ChatGPT and it'll tell me exactly what I need. The reality is you got to take ownership of that project and manage the project, even though you're not building the house. Manage it and make sure that just I know exactly what the local municipality needs and requires, and I know my builder is going to build in a compliant way to that.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think, the very first step in the going tiny process, if you're going to be fixed or permanently placed or semi-permanently placed, is to understand where and to research your where and understand the zoning, understand the building codes that apply, talk to your builder about that. And everything comes down to, because the jurisdictions are um, have so much control over the rules, specifically in that area, and there's not a universal anything. You have to really figure out the where first and foremost.
100%.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the typical problems that you have seen. You mentioned kind of building the house too heavy, or, some other or having a neighbor complain. What are some other challenges that you have seen with people trying to put their tiny homes on land?
Yeah. Well, I think a problem that is a, a common problem kind of ties to what you just said, which is know your where. I would say know your why. You got to know why you're doing this, um, because the chances are you don't want to live in a tiny house just because you like the idea of a smaller house. Period. No other reasons. Right? Chances are it's a tool being used to achieve something, whether it's financial freedom or being kind of with nature or more mobile. There's reasons you're doing this. I think a typical problem I see is people get very fixated on the tiny house and they forget what motivated them to do it in the first place. Uh, we all do this. I do this. Everybody does it. when we get into something, we're like, hey, I really have this vision of what I want. I think I found the way to get there. And sometimes we lose course because we get too focused on that next step. In this case, getting the tiny house. So I think that's a common problem for people because you'll see people really get too specific, which really limits their ability to find land. If you want to be, let's say you decide you want to have a tiny house and but you want to be within 1 hour of Chicago, you're you're probably not finding a place to put one. You're now in an urban and suburban area. Chances are you're not going to find that, right? Um, but if your reason for wanting to be in Chicago is you've always lived there and that's it, maybe it's worth challenging that and saying, well, I don't necessarily need to be in Chicago. Now, if your reason for being in Chicago is your grandchildren live there and you want to help with that, well, that's a really good reason. And I think it's important to just ask yourself, what's more important in this whole ordeal? Is it having the tiny house? Is it the other things in my life, right? Like, what's the most important thing? And once you do that, and you sit down with yourself and with your partner and your family, and you understand, okay, this is actually what I'm trying to achieve, then you can be much more flexible with how you achieve it. You can realize that, oh, I could cross that state line. It's not a huge deal to cross that state line, especially if you're on the East Coast where states are smaller. Um, you can say, oh, you know what? Maybe a tiny house on a foundation will work. Maybe I don't need it to be on wheels. And when you relax your needs, you open up a lot of opportunity for finding land. So if you know your how, then you can know your where, and then you can find land.
I love that. You're singing my song. It's all about values, right? And figuring out what is, deeply most important to you. And, tiny houses are, very romantic ideas for some of us who have been following it on HGTV or whatever. And it seems, they're also perfectly beautiful and clean. Right? But the reality is, it is, still quite complicated to figure out the process. And maybe it isn't, 400 square feet, but maybe you would be, well served by a condo, or maybe you would be well served by, a historical home that was built at 900 square feet, or, lots of my clients, have more what I would call regular sized homes, but they understand what their motivations are, and they're just building an intentional life, instead of just sort of buying as much house as they can afford, because that's what you're supposed to do. So I love that we can kind of expand our opportunities beyond just the really iconic and rigid and sometimes very difficult, challenging path of finding a place where you can legally, safely, and forever put a tiny home, and instead think about what are all the other living options. I mean, I've got people in my community living in shed combos and earth ships and yurts
Yeah,
and all kinds of things, and of course all of those are equally complicated from a legal perspective, but there are just a lot of different ways to live an intentional life. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a tiny house, but if it is, you got to root in to what you're really trying to accomplish. And you got to stay true to that and keep focused on that, because it is a little bit of a gritty
for sure,
process.
for sure.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for all of those great explanations and really breaking all of that down. Would you please share with listeners where they can find you, where they can find your books, where they can follow along on the work that you're doing in the tiny home
Sure,
space?
yeah. So you can find my books by going to Amazon and looking. You can type my name, Jordan Liberata. You could also search Tiny House Practical, which is the book series. These three books. You don't have to read all three of them. They're not really in order, but that's the series, Tiny House Practical. I also am on tinyhousepractical.com, which is my website. And feel free to just reach out to me at jordan@tinyhousepractical.com, and I'll get back to you. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time today. It was super great having you on to explain these really foundational pieces of understanding what's going on in the legalization world and helping people move forward with their dream of tiny living. Super helpful. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
Laura.
much.
This is so fun.
Hey, thank you for taking the time to listen to Less House, More Moolah. I have another free resource on my website for you, the Unconventional Values Quiz. In just 2 minutes, you can pinpoint your style of freedom seeker, security guardian, adventure enthusiast, or community builder. Check it out at thetinyhouseadvisor.com. And one more thing. Podcasts don't have algorithms like social media does. They only grow by word of mouth and reviews. If this podcast is helpful to you, would you please post a review on your podcast app and tell a friend who is trying to live a values based life? It would totally make my day.